Mr. President, the federal budget is a pressing concern for everybody in this body, including myself, especially given the political climate that we have in Congress. We've been two houses divided for some time now. Back in 2011, the Republican House and the Democratic Senate agreed that federal spending was out of control. They just couldn't agree on what to do about it. So members from both chambers came together to give Congress two options: either pass a responsible budget that helped reduce the deficit, or face drastic cuts to every discretionary federal department. That threat of sequester was supposed to represent the end of the road, forcing Congress to put differences aside and to work together. But sometimes even a dead end is not enough to motivate some folks to do the right thing. Congress failed to come up with a bipartisan long-term spending plan, and sequestration went into effect 2 years ago. That sequestration has had devastating effects, both nationally and in my home state of Montana. Take, for instance, sequestration's impact on our national forests. We have some 17 million acres of national forests in Montana, managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Under its current structure, the Forest Service uses the same pool of funds to manage our national forests that it does to fight wildfires. In bad fire years, suppression can consume over 40% of the Forest Service budget. So it is no surprise that their budget is still in disarray 2 years after sequestration cuts of over $200 million during the hot, dry summer that saw millions of acres of trees burn across the West. Sequestration proved to be irresponsible and its impacts long-lasting. And our forests weren't the only casualty. Indian country was slammed from education to health care to infrastructure. Indian Health Service saw its budget cut by a similar amount. Health care in Indian country is chronically underfunded anyway. The additional 5% cut to IHS budget resulted in over 800,000 fewer outpatient visits for Native Americans. Indian schools, many of which in such bad shape that nobody in this body would send their kids there, well, those Indian schools saw their budgets cut by $67 million, which resulted in bigger class size, cutbacks to academic programs, cutbacks to building maintenance, and reduction in technology upgrades. Sequestration was almost as devastating to the public education system in this country, and it had its impact on seniors and low-income children and families. And it will be again if Congress doesn't act. Between now and September 30th, Congress must pass a responsible budget that reduces our deficit. And we have time to agree on that, or we will face greater cuts than we saw last time. The President's budget proposal makes significant investments in infrastructure and education and our outdoors. These initiatives will help grow our economy, particularly in rural states like Montana. But there's one big problem. The President's budget fails to reduce the deficit in a smart and meaningful way. But the other options on the table are worse. The House last week unveiled its budget proposal. It is the height of irresponsibility. The House wants to privatize Medicare by turning it into a voucher program. It wants to turn Medicaid into block grants and then cut those. They want to cut taxes for millionaires and big corporations while they phase out portions of the Earned Income Tax Credit, squeezing the wallets of millions of working-class Americans. The House's plan also cuts the Pell Grant program. It repeals the Affordable Health Care Act. That's no surprise. The House has voted over 50 times to repeal the ACA, ignoring the fact that we have some 16 million more Americans that have affordable access to health care than before the law was passed. But in a show of boundless hypocrisy, the House balances its budget but only by counting the $700 billion in Medicare savings and the $1 trillion in new revenue that the Affordable Health Care Act provides. Now, some folks might say, well, that's the House of Representatives. Look how they handled the funding for the Department of Homeland Security for this year. They nearly shut down the agency tasked with protecting our borders and preventing terrorist attack on Americans. The House gave up on responsible governing years ago. But, Mr. President, the fact of the matter is, the budget before us today in the Senate isn't much different. It repeals the Affordable Health Care Act, but again pretends to keep the $700 billion in savings to Medicare and the $1 trillion of revenue created by the Affordable Health Care Act after it's been repealed. Now, I'm not a farmer, and I'm a farmer, I'm not an accountant. I'm a farmer, not an accountant, I want to make that clear. But I'm going to tell you, this is the kind of new math that doesn't add up to me. The Senate budget, similar to the House, also guts the Pell Grant program by 1/3. Now, why is that important? Well, I'll tell you. In Montana, students are graduating college with more than $27,000 in debt in student loans. The last thing they need is less Pell Grants and more student debt, which is exactly what will happen if this Senate budget passes. It also puts states on the hook for over $1 trillion in Medicaid funding. What's that mean? It means we're not going to take care of it anymore. We're going to push it off on the states and act like it doesn't exist. And just like the House, it raises taxes on the lowest rung of our economic ladder by repealing the extension of the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit. These credits keep millions of working families with relatively low incomes out of poverty. In fact, 13 million Americans. Now, while this rhetoric about passing a balanced budget sounds good, and I will tell you that I do support a balanced budget, the reality, this budget doesn't cut it. It does not balance it. Why? Because this budget relies on gimmicks like using the Overseas Contingency Fund, which is supposed to fund the war in Afghanistan and action against ISIS, but instead has become a slush fund for the Department of Defense. This budget assumes hundreds of billions of dollars in, quote, unallocated cuts. Now, that's great. Great messaging. We're going to slash the budget by hundreds of billions of dollars, but we're not going to tell you where we're going to cut it at. We can talk about cuts, but when it gets to the specifics, the real tough decisions, we're not going to talk about those. We're not even going to tell you where they're at. That's not only secretive, it's dishonest, and it's bad policy, and these kind of smoke and mirrors are the worst Washington has to offer. Now, while the President's budget spends far too much, at least it's honest and open and transparent. The House and Senate budgets are just a display of bad mathematics. They lack any sort of realistic plan to keep our economy growing by investing in America. Instead of balancing these budgets on the back of middle-class families and seniors and students and our nation's most vulnerable, we need to fully invest in the things that help this economy go, like roads and bridges, our outdoor economy, education for our kids and our grandkids, because that's the only way they're going to be able to compete in this global economy. You know, in 2015, every nation is interconnected. Business transactions occur between multinational corporations. Scientific discovery is shared between universities on different continents. Clean air and clean water and carbon emission standards are achieved by international agreements. But global security seems to be a battle that we, the United States, is fighting alone. And at what cost? Last week, my Appropriations Subcommittee on Military Construction held a hearing on Defense Department's construction budget. Now, the United States spends more on defense than the next 9 nations combined. Let me say it one more time. The United States spends more on defense than the next 9 nations combined, including United Kingdom, Germany, India, and yes, China. 2 of America's greatest international threats, ISIS and a nuclear Iran, pose a grave threat to us, but also to our allies in the Middle East and Europe. And yet, we're the ones paying the overwhelming majority of these costs. This budget hides those costs from the American people. And with 47 senators pushing us to go to war with Iran, I think the American people deserve to know how we're spending their dollars overseas. Now, do not misunderstand me. Congress's foremost concern should be with protecting our nation and keeping our communities safe. But that should also be the foremost concern of our allies around the world. Time and time again, though, it's the U.S. taxpayer and American lives that are on the line, and that price is far too high. It's not just dollars and cents, it's the lives of our kids, it's the wounds they will face when they return from war, if they return from war at all. And these are price tags we cannot afford. While we send our troops and our treasures overseas, our allies are free to invest significantly in more public education, health care, infrastructure, research and development, and lower taxes. Why? Because we're paying the bill. Their economies grow in relation to our deficit. As Congress looks to responsibly cut spending, we must look at the billions we waste overseas, and we need to level with the American people about the true costs of war. And while caring for our veterans is a cost that we absolutely should bear, we can no longer afford to fight and fund every international conflict. And we have to stop paying for war on our children's credit card. We need to think about the future and invest in public education, in health care and infrastructure, in sound forest management, and in lower taxes. A global economy and a global defense will allow us to invest in middle-class families, educating our children, protecting our seniors, and making sure that Americans can afford food and shelter. These are investments that we must make. But the budget before us stops investing in America. We can do better, and we must do better.